Can Magic Perform Miracles Part 2? This must be the movie which the gods of physics did not want me to make, because I've had so many problems trying to do this. I couldn't get the presentation I gave to the Culinary Society to work. I couldn't make it into a part of a movie. So I'm going to talk around it, but I'm only going to refer to it. I can't actually show the slides. What I want to address is the way that attitudes, public attitudes to the miraculous, have changed just in my own lifetime. And curiously enough, last Saturday at the UCT Summer School, I went to a lecture on Tolkien's Truth, it was called. And the lecturer happened to mention that the magic and supernatural elements in The Lord of the Rings, which was published in the early 50s, how different it was from the more recent work of, say, J.K. Rowling. Because in J.K. Rowling, in the Harry Potter stories, magic is something that humans can learn. Okay, just, the right humans, not the muggles, but, they can go to school and they can learn to do conjuring and magic, and can make marvellous things happen. They wave wands and instantly things happen and all that. He pointed out there's very little of that in The Lord of the Rings. Their magic is not a skill that one can learn as a human being. And if you take someone who obviously is a magician like Gandalf, he isn't really a human. I don't know if he's elfish extract or something, but he's certainly not someone who just went to school to learn how to do magical tricks. That is something which has changed, the expectation that magic, it's a fantasy, but the expectation in fantasy that one could go and learn to do magic. And that interested me because it fitted in with sort of my ideas. And also I could see how you could extend that argument, because if you think of the most recent, say, television series that have a supernatural element in it, a lot of them drop a piece of what might call real magic, paranormal, into a relatively ordinary real life. Take something like the Leftovers. In the world, suddenly a sort of rapture happens where 10% of the population just mysteriously vanishes. And really the theme of that is, how would ordinary everyday people cope with a miracle like that? Now I know it's a pretty weird thing and weird things happen and all that, but basically, it is, people are fairly ordinary people and they're trying to adjust to something utterly mysterious happening in society, and cults form and things like that. Another example, even better in a way, is Outlander, where in many ways it's a very realistic thing, but one magical thing happens. A person from the 1950s finds himself suddenly transported back to Jacobean times. Now the sort of thing I find very realistic about it is that you might say, great, because she's a nurse and knows a lot about medicine, she would soon rise to the top of that society, because she would just show her healing abilities, and amaze them all and everything. But, you see, this is where it's rather interesting, is that Jacobean times is very anti-witchcraft. So she quickly learns she has to be very careful about showing unusual healing abilities. She could be branded as a witch, and, And another example, of course, she has foreknowledge that the Bonnie Prince Charlie's revolution is going to fail. Now, she gets in with people, supporters of him, and she wants to warn them off. She doesn't want these nice people to be slaughtered. And so she tries pointing out, the British army, the English army is very strong. And that, but of course, they then think that she must be an English agent trying to undermine their movement. You see, so it's really realistic in that way. You think, what could one do if we went back in time? And then you realise actually you're hamstrung in many ways. There are other examples. I think, was it the Outsiders. There was another one about a group of kids on an ASBO who suddenly get miraculous powers, and that's a comedy, but basically, how do you deal with suddenly having miraculous powers? Anyway, that was just one way one might approach this thing about the public's attitude to miraculous evolving just in my lifetime. But the way I wanted to look at it was because I was talking to a group of magicians. Now, actually, they're not occult magicians, they're conjurers, people who do tricks to imitate magic. But I was talking about how their audience has changed. So I'm going to stick to that theme because I've got my notes on it and that. How I began, what inspired me with this was because in the late 70s I became an associate of the Magic Circle, the famous London club for conjurers. And the first evening I went there was going to be a demonstration of mentalism. And I thought, this is great, because mentalism was a particularly interesting area of magic for me. I'm going to use the word magic because, conjuring magic, but I'm talking then about people who do tricks. Anyway, what happened was this old man stood up and said something along these lines. Before I begin, I'd like to make it absolutely clear that I make no claims of paranormal abilities, and that everything you will witness this evening is a simple demonstration of trickery, and so on. And I thought, where's the magic in that? How feeble. I rather despise that thing. Basically he was going to show us some puzzles and not have the decency to give us the answer to the puzzles. And yet I knew why he was doing it. I quickly realised. Because you see, a few years before, Uri Geller had burst on the scene in England. He was someone who claimed he could, with the force of his mind, could bend metal, could make spoons and forks sort of bend and everything. And the conjuring fraternity was disgusted with that because they saw him as not a very good conjurer, pretending that he could do real magic, because he didn't say I'm doing tricks. He said I could do this with my mind. Now the thing was, I thought that was terrific because it made people think. For about a year there was constant discussion, in pubs and all that. It wasn't just all about football and beer. It was about, do you think there's more to the world than we know? It's the power of the mind. Maybe there's things to be discovered. People were talking about it. It caused a lot of discussion. Scientists went to witness this and everything. And how much more interesting that was than this person standing up and saying, I'm now going to try and fool you with a few tricks. But the conjuring world thought this was shameful. Now, you see, the thing is, in the 70s, conjuring had nothing like the sort of reputation that it has now and the public support it has now. It was seen rather as sort of second-rate, mid-brow, lowbrow entertainment. The conjurer was the man who told dirty jokes and then produced women's knickers out of an empty chamber pot, that sort of thing. Now, that wasn't quite fair because there were some fantastic conjurers around in the 50s and 60s. Lewis Ganson, what's his name, Diverne, and people like that. But it was much more inward-looking. It was conjuring for conjurers. Very skillful, good magic done for other magicians to comment on. And in the public eye, there was much less support for conjuring. And this, I think, was an element of envy in the conjuring fraternity. How could someone who is not nearly as clever as us could stand up and just by lying and pretending to be a real magician cause all this, become so famous and everything? Now, what I did in my talks, I went through what I've done really in my two videos on the compass of cultures and the sequence of cultures. I explained that I see 4 I understand things in terms of 4 main cultures in our society, which are complementary to each other, and that I had noticed a sort of cycling phenomenon. And I gave some examples showing posters of how, in the middle of the Victorian times, people got so excited about science, they would actually go to a theatre to watch demonstrations of science as entertainment. And yet, a few years later, they lost interest in science, and it was the mysterious, the magic, fakirs from India dressed up and pretending to do wonderful things, and do spirits return and all that sort of stuff, and how that came after the interest in science. And then, of course, we moved on to Houdini doing exposés, rather like today's countries like Darren Brown, saying, we can show you how it's faked, and all that. And I pointed out a similar thing happened in the 50s and 60s. There was a magical revival towards the end of the 60s, whereas the 50s was actually a very sceptical, everyone thought science had all the answers. But then I pointed out, more importantly, the big shift that happened around about 0 AD, when after 5 centuries of rationalist thinking, they were followed by 5 centuries of magical thinking, the birth of astrology, Neoplatonism, alternative medicine, alchemy, all these things happened after we had 5 centuries. And I suggest a similar change is happening now. And that's why I focused on the changes I noticed in public attitudes to magic. Now, going back to the 50s, when I was brought up, that was a time of very great skepticism and belief in science as the answer to everything. And when I was at Cambridge in the 60s, quite a bit later, we had a very interesting lecture by a visiting medical hypnotist. And he gave an example of how great a resistance was even to hypnotism in the 50s. And he described after the war, there was a ward full of wounded soldiers, and he came to give a talk to them about hypnotism and the powers of the mind and that. And many of them had great difficulty accepting that even when they saw it demonstrated that hypnotism was real. And in fact, one person was so certain that it was all fake that he gave him post-it noted suggestions of the sort, snap my fingers and everyone becomes visible in the ward. Snap them again and everyone is visible again. Now you'd think that the person would say, oh, good heavens, everyone's vanished. But no, you didn't react at all. And then if the person tried to test him by saying, could you ask the guy in the next bed what he thinks? He would just look and say, oh, he's gone out. Snap the fingers, come back. Are you sure? Could you ask again? Oh, good, he's back. In other words, the guy just wasn't seeing anything mysterious. And so, in desperation, the hypnotist gave a suggestion that when he snapped his fingers, half of everyone would go invisible. And what happens? The person had a sort of almost a nervous breakdown. He was absolutely shattered and really had to be, the hypnotist had to bring him down rather steadily and deprogram him after that. Now, you see, that intrigued me because it showed that that generation, like my parents' generation, they were so sure of the seeing is believing. Don't fool me with all this nonsense about fairies and yoga and stuff. Look, I haven't seen a fairy, show me one, then I'll believe, otherwise rubbish. It was a very, very hard materialist view. Now see, my generation accepted the idea of illusion, delusion, hypnosis, suggestion. And so we had a different attitude to it. For instance, there used to be talk about the Indian rope trick, guy has a rope, throws up in the air, it stays up straight, little child runs up it, then vanishes. Now the previous generation tended to sort of analyse that in terms of mechanisms that could make that happen. You have a rope with sort of inside it bits that fit together so that if you straighten it up then it would stay straight, and maybe it was done under a tree, and a mirror and so on and so forth. Now, my generation would think more in terms of, must have been some misdirection. You know, I'm sure the audience just looked away at the moment when the kid vanished, and then the person would have put suggestions to them. You know, you were all watching all the time, weren't you? Yes, oh yes, that's it. You know, and that's how they go. Remember. In other words, we would look at more illusion to explain this. Now, the point I wanted to make is that when we look at today's street magicians as shown on television, you know, television things about Dynamo, David Blaine and things like that, look at the reactions of the audience. Oh my God, you went straight through that window. Oh my God, you just vanished. Now you see, it's a small difference, but my generation was said, good Lord, it looked just like he went through that window. Or he just seemed to vanish. You know, we would be surprised and astonished, but we'd just put the words in like he seemed to, or it looked like, because we still tend to think in terms of it must be, you know, a trick. Now, I'm not saying that the modern audience really accepts 100% that this was real magic they witnessed. It's just that their first reaction is, oh my God, a miracle. I'm sure if you took them aside, you know, and said, are you absolutely sure it was, they'd say, no, of course it must be a trick or something. But I just talk about that first reaction, and you see, that is a big change. You see, part of the reason that conjurers were not very popular up to the 70s was because there really were a lot of people who didn't want to see miraculous things. It was disturbing to them. And yet, you know, my generation quite liked it, but took it as a sort of an illusion, an example of the mind's trickery. Whereas people now love it. You've done something to the world. And I actually ended my presentation with a clip that you can get off YouTube of a slow-mo shot of a sequence of Dynamo. He levitates in Brazil in front of that great thing of Christ, with a whole crowd of people around, and then he walks down through the crowd. And the point I was making is just look at the faces of the people there. In the crowd, I didn't see anyone sort of thinking, I wonder how that was done, you know. What you see is open-mouthed wonderment. People just enjoying the spectacle of miracle. Now, as I was talking to conjurers, magicians, I majored on actually evolution that was taking place in magic itself, in conjuring itself. And I said that I was interested in seeing this mentalist because although there wasn't great public interest in conjuring at the time, mentalism was actually quite alive because, in the words of the bizarre magician Doc Shields, that was the one area of conjuring that people could slightly believe in. In other words, everyone knew you can't just pull a rabbit out of an empty hat. But if someone can seem to be able to read your mind about a card you've just taken, that's believable. And therefore, it was better magic, better entertainment. And in fact, there's an evolution that took place following the 70s. On the one hand, there was a group of conjurers who call themselves bizarre magicians. Now, they played up the storytelling, the drama, in a way that big conjurers in the Victorian days would have done. You know the trick of where you put a silk handkerchief over a sphere and it floats up, and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of people have an idea of the mechanism of that. And so it's still a beautiful trick, but it depends entirely on the miming skill of the conjurer to make it into a really beautiful piece of magic. But you see, what the bizarre magician would do would be not to do it under bright lights, but to turn down the lights, even just work by one candle. And he would weave a story about, you know, when he was in the South American desert, he came across a looted tomb and there was a skull, and he stole this skull. And since then there's been a curse on his life. And how this, he haunts him, and this skull sometimes gets out of control. And as he's speaking, it begins to float up, and so forth. And everyone, whoa, everyone's really thrilled by this. Now, the irony is, you see that in the conditions he's set out by dim candlelight, it's far easier to do the conjuring. You could be a much worse conjurer as a bizarre magician, but a great storyteller and a great entertainer. And then I pointed out at the other end there's the mentalism. On the one hand, you still get people like that person who's saying, I make no claims. And you get people like Darren Brown who are exposing psychic phenomena, saying this is just trickery, that. But on the other hand, you get more people who say, why should I tell people, dictate to them how they should think? Why not just present something extraordinary and let them decide for themselves whether they think it's magic or not? And those people are psychic entertainers. They presented an entertaining evening of psychism. And they don't say, I'm just doing fake stuff. And then the bizarre magicians and psychic entertainers come together, and there's a group called the mystery entertainers who say, you just have to do a little bit of trickery, get the audience in the right frame of mind, and the audience will provide the magic. And people want this. You're giving the opening windows to a newer, greater, more mysterious world, and people love it. Don't dictate to them and say this is all fake. Don't insist that it is real. Just leave them with this mystery. Leave them thinking in the way that Uri Geller did. Leave people going away saying, I wonder if there's more to the world than that. The mystery entertainers. Now, I then went on to say, from the conjurer's point of view, they see two streams here. One is what they call the open eye psychics. The people who know it's all a trick, and they pretend they do cold reading, they do all the fakery, and they know it's all fake. And some people would like to think that's how it is. Anyone who learns cold reading will soon learn that there's nothing in psychism or the supernatural. And that's how, for instance, the amazing Randy, he offers £1 million to anyone who can demonstrate, supernatural phenomena or something like that, and under test conditions. And he never needs to do those test conditions because people go along and he just explains to them, what you're doing can be explained away in terms of this, that, the other. So he's like Houdini, he's onto a good conjuring trick there. Now the other side, and this is I find rather fascinating, are the people who learn how to do cold reading. They learn how to do fake magic, and they get so good at it they begin to find that they have real psychic abilities. And there's a surprising number of people who do that. In fact, one of the things that fascinated me that the bizarre magician Doc Shield said in his little book on, I can't remember what it's called now, but I wrote about it in Blast Your Way to Megabucks. One of the essays in that volume describes this. He said, start the evening with a few examples of conjuring tricks and mental magic, and then get on to some real psychic experiments, and you'll get very good results. Whereas I would have thought that once you've shown people the trickery, then they wouldn't ever believe anything else, and they would be, as it were, their minds would be closed to the psychic. He said quite the opposite. So, you see, in the world of conjurers' world, there are these two different theories that run. Now I said, what about the public? Now, the old public view of the conjurer is, well, he's a person who does tricks, and we love it, okay, we know it's all trickery, but what fun. And then there's the people who say, I know it's tricks, but I think this guy's got amazing abilities. Now the funny thing is, a lot of Derren Brown's followers, although he is ostensibly showing that this is just done by trickery, there's no supernatural in it, a lot of his followers say Derren Brown's got extraordinary powers. And of course he has, because you can learn cold reading and you don't necessarily do it as well as he does. He has got extraordinary abilities as a cold reader that he's very good at. They're beyond the normal, but are they paranormal? And then there are the people who say, I know it was really just entertainment, but I think there was something more there. The people who really are sort of open to the mysterious, they're looking for something wonderful. And I would say the people who say, here's someone who allows magic to happen. Now that's an interesting development in conjuring itself, because I think his name is Sankey. There's the idea of bending the real, another approach to conjuring, which is a fairly recent one, which is, let us imagine you're a conjurer and you've thought up a way of making a pencil levitate in front of people's eyes. Now, the traditional sort of conjuring thing to do would say, ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to examine this pencil and assure yourself that it is perfectly normal and it has no mirrors or trapdoors on it, and they look at it and all that sort of thing. And then, now watch very carefully, look, it's levitating, and I will now take a hoop and pass it over so that you can see there are no threads involved. I mean, that's exaggerating, but that's a sort of like traditional conjurer. Now what this guy would say is, just talk about something that really interests you, a good story or something like that. At one point you pick up a pencil to make a point, sort of thing. And then while you're talking, your hand moves away, it's just left levitating. And suddenly you pretend to notice, look a bit surprised, grab it, put it down on the table and just go on talking. How do people react? Excuse me, did that pencil, did I see it floating in the air? Am I mad? Other people say, yes. And you just say, oh, yeah, haven't you noticed that sometimes when you're really sort of carried away talking, funny things happen, and then you just go on with your story. And so you leave people sort of saying, did I see something extraordinary or did I not? In other words, you've just given people a little glimpse of the mysterious, and that's a gift. So the audience for conjurers is changing. That was my point I'm making. And they're much more open to the mysterious, the possibility of magic now, than they were even back in the 50s when I was young. And so in the third of these videos, I'm going to talk about some of my own experiences of mysterious things happening, and whether it's significant and how important it is.